These are the children of El Salvador, Central America. Around them, in the tiny country they'll inherit, one of the world's deadliest conflicts today. 5,000 people have died in political killings this year. About 30 bodies are discovered daily, many mutilated. Priests are murdered, hospital patients dragged from their beds and executed. For a child growing up here, these are now facts of life. Here's what it's like. August in El Salvador, a country of great beauty, a center of ancient civilizations, now the theater for daily killing and torture. A senior US government official visits the country. He reports, El Salvador is the most volatile country in Central America, a classical setting for social and political unrest, with one of the most rigid class structures in the hemisphere. Serious human rights violations, a political system unable to accommodate dissent. He concludes, the prospects for avoiding insurrectional violence are rapidly diminishing. He made his visit and his report fully a year ago, before the autumn coup by young army officers that overthrew rightist General Romero. Then the Marxist takeover in Nicaragua next door heightened political violence, guerrilla killings, arbitrary arrests, kidnappings. Today, the words still apply, but there are 6 times as many political murders and still no insurrection. How can such violence continue? How has the ruling center-left junta of soldiers and civilians been able to survive? Ten months ago, their coup ended a history of military rule. They promised free elections. They say they haven't held them because of continued leftist terrorism. By the new year, the junta already couldn't control violence by right-wing terrorists and by its own army. But they persisted with reform. They promised land reform and nationalized banks. Late March, violence reached a new stage. Archbishop Romero, a spokesman for the people, critic of the growing repression by security forces in their drive against leftists, was assassinated. The people loved him. He was their only spokesman with power and influence. At his public funeral a week later, thousands gathered. This is what happened. "40 dead, 450 injured. The junta say leftists fired shots, that they caused the panic that crushed people to death. Foreign observers say government troops started firing, and the leftists just retaliated. A few weeks later, the whole left united. Former government members, labor and student organizations, guerrillas. They formed a single grouping with a socialist government program. This summer, El Salvador has been experiencing its worst violence for years. The leftists kill some people, but the security forces and the rightist groups allied with them kill most. Every day there are wild accusations of leftism. Every day, new political killings. These are suspected leftists. The troops will search them at gunpoint. Humiliating exercises like these cause widespread resentment among the population. After a successful general strike in June, leftist leaders reject the junta's call for a political dialogue. They say the junta have curbed people's liberty. They also say the people can't ally with those who are killing them. The junta no longer claims to be trapped between far left and far right. It's made peace with the private sector. The priority now is to destroy the left. Leftist guerrilla groups claim 15,000 men in arms, backed by a citizens' militia of 200,000 people. But they've no joint command and not many weapons. Behind this show of force, there's a different story. A recent government offensive has killed every one of the MLP guerrillas seen here. There's no evidence the guerrillas have widespread support. But many students have sympathy with their cause. In July, government forces attacked the National University, backed by helicopters and armored cars. The university, a leftist stronghold the troops have to eliminate. Here they find the headquarters of guerrilla groups. The troops kill at least 6 students, suspected leftists, some shot in cold blood. Here's one of those shootings as it happened. This raid smashed the heart of the guerrilla groups. It forced them out of the capital. Once inside these offices, troops found precious information on terrorist activities. In this box, the leftist propaganda leaflets that were to help bring down a regime. Mid-August. By now, the anti-guerrilla offensive has changed. Before, assassinations by rightist groups countered sporadic leftist raids. Now, helicopter gunships support troop build-ups. They prepare planned assaults on guerrilla nests and villages like this one. These are now direct government military operations against leftist guerrillas. One goal is to evacuate civilians from leftist strongholds, but Red Cross workers say offensives like these kill more civilians than terrorists. Rightist commandos openly back the junta troops. Commandos responsible for most of the mutilated bodies discovered around El Salvador. The opposition again calls a national strike. But this time, workers don't respond. To defuse the strike, the government had again promised elections, again fixing no date. When leftist guerrillas try to enforce the stoppage, 34 people die. This then is the story of El Salvador in the last year. The violence and repression are severe. They are not so rare in a country where an elite class has long ruled at the expense of the urban and rural poor. In a country where less than 50 years ago, the army killed 30,000 people to put down a peasant revolt. Inequalities and repression have split El Salvador into left and right. But what is unusual is the junta's land reform program. This country has a legacy of extremism, so the moderate reform should have collapsed as soon as the junta announced the project. Why have they persisted this time? What's their true function? Maybe this is the real story of El Salvador. In a nation where violence is everywhere, there are people fighting a new kind of war. There's a new front line, not in the factories, the universities, or the mountains, but here, in the country fields, on the farmland, in agrarian reform. These fields are the battleground for the hearts and minds of Salvadorian peasants. And in the scenario of how this has come to be, the United States' role is crucial. The Americans welcomed the reformist regime. They rejected the extremist options. They believe the left here does not represent the people. They feel the guerrillas are isolated. But the US also has moral concern about government repression, human rights violations. The Americans may fear repression could make peasants and workers turn to the left. That would break the guerrillas' isolation. It could bring about revolution, like the Marxist uprising in Nicaragua next door. They might then fear another neighbor, Guatemala, will be the next to fall left. Then maybe Honduras. The domino effect in Central America would mean the collapse of US prestige in the region. So here in El Salvador, a new line has been drawn to guard the sphere of influence. By backing the junta then, the Americans may have felt they'd learned from the fall of Nicaragua. They'd back a moral regime, a government of the center. They'd back agrarian reform to satisfy peasant aspirations, to prevent them swinging left. This would keep El Salvador from revolution and keep US influence in Central America. With the peasants satisfied, the leftists would stay isolated. And with the leftist guerrillas isolated, the army could eliminate them without provoking widespread reaction. This could be the US strategy of reform. An El Salvador regime that's morally right and strategically right also. Symbols of American presence, like this Coca-Cola truck, have been prime guerrilla targets. For the US has given $50 million in aid to stabilize the present regime. Ever since the coup, the Americans have reaffirmed their commitment to reform. They've told the military, landowners and businessmen they'd withdraw their aid if human rights were abused. And yet, by the spring, the strategy of reform was being strained. These men, the junta, couldn't control the security forces in formal alliance with far-right groups in the drive against leftists. And that anti-leftist drive was hurting large sectors of the population. It was encouraging sympathy for the guerrillas. In the spring, the US persisted with a large loan for the land reform program. But by June, the American ambassador was saying, there's a question of who governs this country. He said the right was the threat. The US has held back military aid to help curb repression by the army and rightist allies. That hasn't worked. But the Americans are now committed. At last they've approved anti-terrorist aid for more disciplined, organized troops. They originally backed a centrist junta. Now, through the junta, they've found themselves aligned with the right. And yet, so far, reform strategy has been effective. There's been no revolution. Violence has hit peasants like these. Whole villages have been victimized because of suspected leftist links. But they've tolerated repression in return for the promised gains from land reform. They're simple people. Now their lives are caught in a net of conflict. This summer, rightist voices are rising. They distrust agrarian reform. They want to sabotage it. They say it goes too far. They claim it's a real gain of leftist pressure, a damaging change in the fabric of Salvadorian society, a kind of revolution. The left think the reform just appeases peasant aspirations to prevent an uprising. They say it simply reinforces the present regime, capitalist and repressive. But just how far do the reforms really go? On the answer depends the political future of this country today. Impressive figures show the scale of the promised reform. It gives half the nation's arable land to over 1 million landless peasants, a fifth of El Salvador's entire population. Before the reform, only about 5,000 families owned land. When it's complete, nearly 200,000 families will benefit. Former owners get compensation. New title holders have 30 years to pay. But these reforms aren't revolutionary. Private firms control distribution and shipment of cash crops for export, cotton, sugarcane, bananas. They're vital to the nation's economy. And the government handles coffee distribution, so the peasants will own none of the major food networks. No revolution then. Even as reforms on banana plantations like this one, they'll need government finance if they're really to take effect. The peasants often just aren't getting that investment. And cooperatives like this one are large. They need a large workforce. Observers feel there are sure to be labor problems also. The reform's second stage transfers land to small tenant farmers and sharecroppers. They produce food for local needs. The government announced this stage 4 months ago. The tenant is to farm the land as before. He'll simply pay no rent. But this reform still hasn't taken effect. There's a fear if it does, powerful local landlords could take revenge. The junta announced the whole reform 6 months ago. As yet, it's solved nothing. The left says it doesn't go far enough and it's not being properly implemented. The rightists feel the reform shouldn't happen, especially while leftist agitation continues. They believe if they can crush the left, then the impetus for reform will fade. Because there'll be then no need to make further gestures to appease the peasants. The junta and the Americans saw the reform as a center path to reconcile the extremes. In fact, the issue of reform has only widened the gap between left and right. The government say leftist guerrillas have intimidated peasants who cooperate in reform. But the peasants we spoke to told us a different story. Men dressed in army uniform had entered their farm and killed 7 workers. This confirms reports of rightist efforts to disrupt the reform program. But it's hard to know how most peasants feel. Some certainly supported a recent strike. But many peasants on this cooperative are content with reform. They say things are better than before. Like this girl throwing fertilizer onto maize. She favors reform because she's earning more money. She might even get $9 a day.
Hoy dicen que las tareas las dan de 9 y aquí la daban de 10 tareas.
The peasants here also told us things are better with agrarian reform. They say they've got work all the time now and they earn more money. So peasants have profited from reform, but the price has been their silence. The Land Reform Agency complains about practical problems, like getting government aid for new pumping equipment. But peasants who complain about security force killings, rightist torture, may not just lose government finance, they may well be labelled as leftists. They may be imprisoned or forced to flee their land. This is the mechanism of fear. It's crucial to the reformist strategy. For the moment, then, the junta has absorbed revolutionary aspirations. It has deflected them towards a still largely unfulfilled reform program. And yet, before this spring, the church, which gives the peasants community, identity, faith, also gave them more. The church spoke for them through Archbishop Romero, and he was a threat to the reform strategy. The churchman here celebrates Mass, but Archbishop Romero also criticized the government for human rights violations. He was a radical. He called for changes in the very structure of society. He was a bridge between the left and the peasant masses. He conveyed a radical message in the same context as faith and tradition. The new archbishop criticizes the government far less. Without the figurehead of Romero, the church's influence has declined. There are few radical sermons for the peasants to hear. Without Romero, the left is further isolated. That need to neutralize the left underlies all the junta's promises for land reform. Here, 2 junta members visit a farm cooperative. They're checking the progress of land reform. Their country has a history of violence and inequality, but to the peasants here, they're promising a future of calm and prosperity. How will these peasants react if the promises aren't kept? For what the junta may well be doing here is appeasing historically high peasant aspirations, appeasing them with claims that can never be kept because of rightist opposition. Here, the junta promotes its reform. Elsewhere, talking to businessmen or landowners, it will use other arguments to try and disarm rightist opposition, to reconcile them with the reform program. The junta tells them business and industry will improve as farm production increases with reform. The whole economy will benefit. People will demand more housing, consumer goods and services. This renaissance will begin within a year. Soon, El Salvador will have an economic miracle, the potential to become the Japan of Central America. These are the junta's models: Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. It is on such totally different political context that the reformist dream is based. The prospects for the agrarian program, then, could well be bleak. It may not be fully implemented at all, or it may meet with enough rightist opposition to ensure failure. Either way, peasant disappointment with high expectations raised by the junta could surely lead to a leftist resurgence. And in this country now, that can only mean more violence, more killing in a nation sated with it. Watch these scenes. They encapsulate the story of El Salvador today. In these quiet woods in the early morning, workers collect a dumped, rotting corpse, another victim of terrorism. The men need masks. The stench is overpowering. It could be a garbage collection. Here it's the dull routine of death. A somber future then for the children of El Salvador. Though everything has been promised, in the junta's words, El Salvador is living a transcendental stage of its history. We are forming a new nation that our children will inherit. We want this to be a more worthy nation with greater dignity and more justice. That is the promise. But these are the tears of a nation. Around this helpless country, in the towns and all over El Salvador, the violence goes on.